Hello, and welcome to Guilty Pleasures, the show where we give in to pleasure, rising from our coffins to discuss a modern horror film and debating just how guilty we need to feel about loving or hating it. It was my pick this month, and I was once again desperate for any excuse to talk about the greatest actor of our generation, and possibly of any generation, Nicolas Cage. We asked our adoring fans to choose between 2021's Prisoners of the Ghostland and 2023's Renfield. In an absolute bloodbath of an online vote, Renfield eviscerated the competition to earn its time in the light of this podcast. So welcome us into your ears as we find out if Renfield glamours us with its charms or sucks the life out of us. Now, before we sink our teeth into this one, my name is Stephanie, and I'm going to be your queen of the night for this episode. I'm joined by my loyal familiars, Kelly and Jack. I'm going to ask the eternally lovely Kelly to help us unearth some key background information on this film before we start diving into it. Kelly, what have you got for us?
I have got that Renfield was made in 2023, as Steph mentioned, and it was based on a story by Robert Kirkman, which all of us horror aficionados are delighted by, I am certain. It was directed by Chris McKay, who most people probably know from the Lego Batman movie, which is pretty fun. It had a budget of $65 million, and the box office was $26.7 million, which I think probably qualifies it as a certified flop. But it did kind of middle of the road work with critics. It was neither beloved nor beloathed, a word that we're going to say exists. Rotten Tomatoes gave it a 58%. IMDb gives it 6.4 out of 10. Metacritic gives it 53%, and Letterboxd gives it 2.9. I'm going to say I think that's all pretty goddamn fair. But we're going to save my thoughts on that for later, and I'm going to throw it back to Steph so she can throw it back to Jack.
So, as per usual, before we get into our overall thoughts and impressions, we, being the consummate professionals we are, like to dig a little deeper and just see if there's any fascinating facts or BTS intrigue about our film that we can share with our lovely listeners. And that is where Jack comes in. Jack, do you have anything for us?
Hey guys, I mean, outside of talking about the cast, because it is relatively new, I don't have as much as I would like, but we can kind of touch on that a little bit. Renfield stars Nicholas Hoult as titular character Renfield. He's been in a wide range of offerings, including Warm Bodies, several of the X-Men movies, Those Who Wish Me Dead, and then my personal favorite, Mad Max Fury Road. Awkwafina as Rebecca. You've seen her in Ocean's 8. Crazy Rich Asians, and Marvel's Shang-Chi. She has also provided voice work for The Dark Crystal, Age of Resistance on Netflix, Raya and the Last Dragon, and Disney's live-action Little Mermaid reboot. I'm going to butcher this name, and I apologize. It's Shore Agdashlu. She is Bella Francesca. She's been very prolific. She's been in Star Trek Beyond, The Exorcism of Emily Rose, House of Sand and Fog, and the stellar science fiction series The Expanse. She has also lent her distinctive voice to numerous video games and animated features. We also have Ben Schwartz as Teddy. He's been all over the map. You probably saw him first. I think everybody saw him first in Parks and Recreation. He was also in House of Lies and Space Force. His voice has also been in a bajillion projects, such as Rise of the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles, DuckTales, BoJack Horseman, and Bob's Burgers. And then there was this other dude in the movie, some guy named Nicolas Cage. You might know him, you might not. I don't know. He's been in a couple films. Renfield actually marks his first return back to major studio filmmaking following 2011's Ghost Rider, Spirit of Vengeance. Ever since that point, he's been in just a bunch of smaller kind of love letter offerings and indie offerings, which I think is great that he lends his power and his prestige to those films. We talked about one on our last podcast, Pig. So anyways, that guy, Nick, he happens to play Count Dracula. And then for behind the scenes, random stuff, there's not a lot to really talk about. It's just interesting when you look at it that Nicolas Cage is nephew to Francis Ford Coppola, who happened to direct the 1992 version of Dracula with Gary Oldman. So it's an interesting kind of turn of events. This is a character he's always wanted to play. He is a very big fan of Christopher Lee and considers Christopher Lee's take on Dracula to be the best takes ever. And so he actually, in starring with Christopher Lee, I think he kind of just really wanted to pay homage to that character and to that actor and sink his teeth, so, as it were, into this role. And so this is kind of like the role that he's always wanted to play. And I think, judging from all the little interviews and stuff I've read, like, he really went all in on this one and researched as much as he could possibly research.
And this is where we get into this guilty pleasure, and we figure out if it is, in fact, both guilty and a pleasure. We're going to start with our overall impressions, any particular highlights or lowlights, if you will, that stood out to each of us.
I'll tell you, my first experience with this movie was entirely voluntary and independent of this podcast. It was released at kind of a time when there wasn't an abundance of horror movies, and I just wanted something that felt kind of, of that world. And I like Nicholas Hoult. I like Nick Cage. I thought it seemed like it might be pretty fun. And my overall takeaway from it is that it is pretty fun. I think it might be a movie that's best if you watch it once and then don't rewatch it, because at least 3 times in my notes, I just have the question, what is Renfield? I think that the definition of Renfield, especially for people who maybe have read Dracula, have seen Dracula, who understand that he's really just supposed to be a human with delusions, it's really perplexing what exactly he's supposed to be in this movie. What the limitations of his powers are, what the nature of it is, even what his motivation is to a certain extent. I don't want to get really boring, so I'll try and be brief about this, but like, a big part of my horror coming of age was reading Dracula when I was like 10 years old. It was huge and massively formative for me, and I adore the Francis Ford Coppola version, even though we can certainly get into the weeds about the accuracy of that. So Dracula is a story that I have a lot of history with, and I don't mind rewriting lore because it's all fiction. There were just some things that I felt were a little bit ill-defined. But what I cannot argue with is Nicholas Hoult is adorable. Nicolas Cage is delightful. I recently watched The Vampire's Kiss, and it's kind of crazy how much more restrained as Dracula Nicolas Cage is versus what he is in that movie. I don't want to get like too in the weeds. You guys have lots to say. So my overall impression is that it's a pretty fun movie that's maybe a little bit too long, and that maybe has too many masters it's trying to serve, but is still kind of funny and charming, and not a bad way to spend a Sunday morning if you happen to be watching it before you record a podcast.
That was awesome. Jack, do you want to share your thoughts? Is this your, since I picked this film, is this your first time watch or rewatch?
Yeah, so this was one that was on my radar because I'll typically watch anything with Nicholas Hoult in it, and I'll typically watch anything with Nicolas Cage in it. I don't always get the chance to. So this one was kind of on my radar as hey, I need to get to this at some point. And then I saw that it was on streaming. I was like, great, I'm going to watch this. And then it came up that we're going to podcast for it. Even better, I can watch it as a first time watch. And I did so this morning. I was going to watch it last night. It's like, you know what? I'm going to save it for the morning. I want it to be fresh. And so I kind of agree with Kelly. I think it suffers a bit from an identity crisis. And I think that's partly due to the overarching, because you can't really talk about this movie without talking about kind of the MonsterVerse in general, which was Universal's attempt, which I thought at the time was kind of a cool idea, if a little derivative, right? I mean, Marvel was doing this extended universe, and all these other projects were starting to do this multiverse concept. And so I thought it was interesting that Universal was jumping on board with their MonsterVerse franchise. And the kind of roundabout sequence of events that got us here is that Dracula Untold was supposed to be the kickoff point for that concept, but it didn't get very good reception. So they really downplayed its connection to the MonsterVerse in general. Then we have the Mummy reboot with Tom Cruise, which was a fucking train wreck of a film and should never have been released. That was repositioned as the kickoff point. And then when that movie was dead on arrival, the entire concept of the MonsterVerse at that point was dead on arrival. So I think there was a lot of pushback from Universal saying, okay, we're not going to do this big MonsterVerse thing. We're going to have individual stories. Fortunately, Lee Whannell's The Invisible Man was a fantastic film and has kind of relaunched that concept, but they're not really making it obvious. They're not, advertising it as such or keeping it very simple. But this one kind of allowed for Renfield to be greenlit, and I love that thing. But I love that fact. But I do think that tonally the movie is kind of unsure because it is coming from a very dramatic, very serious source material, even taking into account that it is a somewhat sequel to that 1931 film. And then it's also trying to be kind of hip and modern and fun and playing real loose with the overarching concepts. And again, same thing. I struggle with movies where things are ill-defined and it's like, to Kelly's point, what are the extent of his powers? What can he do? What can't he do? And then of course I'm always like, how can a tiny little bug grant that much power? So it's this kind of this weird dichotomy for me where it was a lot of fun. It was also kind of a little bit of tonal whiplash. So I liked it. I cannot say that I didn't like it, and I cannot say that I was not entertained. I was absolutely entertained, but I was frequently scratching my head at the tonal disconnect of this movie, and then how much I think it still is kind of a slave to the overarching MonsterVerse concept and how that kind of informed what this movie ended up being.
So let me say this. I did see this film the second it landed in theaters, and obviously I did. This film was not only do I think that I'm in the target audience, I may be the target audience. This movie may have been made exactly for me. Nick Cage can do no wrong in my heart, so I will see literally every fucking thing he is in. Now you say Nicolas Cage is going to be Dracula, I'm like, hell yes. Like, does it get any better than that? In my book, no. So I think it's hard when I talk about a film like this because I'm so predisposed to love it that it's almost impossible for me not to love it. Like, the cards are stacked so heavily in its favor when it comes to me that it would basically have to, I don't even know what it would have to do. It'd have to work really, really hard to get me to say, that's really not for me. Thanks. When I saw it the first time, I fucking loved it. I thought it was an absolute delight. I was really devastated that it did pretty poorly. And part of the reason it is considered a flop is because it did cost quite a bit to make, especially for horror film. It was a big budget film, and so it needed to really, really kill it in order to be considered profitable. I think it is wildly entertaining. However, some of the criticism that I've seen that you guys both brought up, and Jack, I think you really nailed this. I'm not going to sit here and say like perfect film. It's not a perfect film by any way, shape, or form. When you say things like tonally inconsistent, it has an identity crisis, it doesn't really know what it wants to be, I think 100%. That's all very, very fair. For me, I can overlook a lot of that because at the end of the day, I'm like, well, did I have fun with it? Yeah, I have fun with it. I rewatched it for this podcast. It was just as charming for me the second time, and Kelly said that it wasn't as good on a rewatch. I had equal amount of fun, and I'm trying to think back. Did I enjoy it? I think there was probably a little bit more enjoyment the first time just because I didn't know what to expect and it was all fresh and new. But it was still super fun to rewatch. I'm gonna wrap this little very long intro by I would like to, if you guys will indulge me, I want to read this mini review from Reddit about this film because it made me laugh out loud, and I think it's kind of like the most perfect fucking synopsis ever.
Go for it.
Here goes. It's a goddamn buddy cop flick with Aquafina, whom I adore, and the kid from About a Boy who somehow grew up to be the most handsome motherfucker on the planet, running around John Wicking the shit out of everyone. 5 stars. All right, I'm going to stop talking now. And we can start jumping into specific things that jumped out at us that we either thought were really delightful or really problematic. Kelly, are you?
I wish you could have seen me slow moving my finger to the mute button so that I could just ease my way on in here.
I could hear you on mute, and I was like, "Oh, she has something to say about something I said."
Well, it's interesting because none of what I'm gonna say is gonna contradict what you said, Steph. My first comment is that the first time I watched this movie, I watched it with my mom, and I had a lot more fun watching it with somebody than I had watching it by myself. I watched it alone this morning, and it's weird how when you don't have somebody to be like, isn't that crazy? You're like, wait a second, isn't that crazy? And it just kind of changes the tenor a little bit. So I think this is a really fun movie to watch with friends or somebody who, has your same sensibility. The second thing, Nicholas Hoult is amazing. I have no notes on him whatsoever. He is very handsome, super cute, but also like he gets this movie. I think that when you're doing a movie like this, like Renfield, it really helps if the actors starring in it understand the movie that they're in. And I feel like he understands the movie he's in. He's having fun with it. He's silly and light with it. And I'm coming at this from, and I would imagine both of you are, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, but like, I'm guessing all three of us are relatively big fans of the Francis Ford Coppola Dracula. And as a result, we're probably all pretty big fans of Tom Waits as Renfield.
Yeah.
So, redefining that character, I won't say that I find this Renfield as charming as Tom Waits is, because I think that Tom Waits digs into the madness of Renfield. But I thought he's really likable, and he's a really easy character to be kind of cheering for and wanting the best for, and he is super charming. My last note, Steph, on what you said, and this isn't a statement, it's genuinely a question, is this a horror movie? I don't know that I'd call this a horror movie. It's got horror trappings for certain, but and I'm throwing it to you guys to say what you think about that.
Yeah. This isn't a horror film, and I don't know that it is even trying to be. And I think that's partly maybe why I did struggle a little bit with the tonal disconnect, is that, that at its core, Dracula is one of the quintessential horror tales. And so by stepping so far away from the trappings of what it is, which is, we're always kind of talking about taking a swing. And I will always admire filmmakers who want to take a swing and writers who want to take a swing at a franchise and say, I'm going to try something a little different. But with the fact that it is very much a buddy cop, little rom-com kind of buddy cop-ish, with a lot of, like, Steph said, very good, very well scripted, well shot, well choreographed action scenes that are on par and or better than a lot of so-called action movies, if you will, where this really kind of nails that aesthetic. And you always know where people are in the frame, and you always understand what's happening with each character. And a lot of action movies kind of flub that, so it's kind of funny that this one, which ostensibly is not an action movie, really ultimately becomes, to an extent, one of the better action movies out there, just by virtue of that choreography and the editing alone. So I cannot say that this is a horror movie at all. It's a comedy action movie with some bloody elements to it, or a lot of bloody elements to it, actually.
Well, I think so. I'll give you my take. I think we're going to venture into probably one of the most controversial topics ever among horror fans. And that is the question of, how do you define horror? What is horror? I have a really wide berth for what I consider horror. And that's part of why I love the genre so much, is because I think it's so inclusive, and I think it's so many things to so many people. I've never heard anyone, and I've had this debate many, many, many times, I've never heard anyone nail the definition of horror in a way that sits right with me, where I'm like, okay, I get it now. I think this is a horror comedy. I think first of all, anytime you're dealing with a love letter to the foundations of horror and a horror classic like Dracula that has birthed so much of the genre, I think when we start getting into defining what is horror and what is not, I mean, this is certainly, my assessment of this would be that it's very genre bending.
I think that Nick Cage does a really astonishingly great job as a vampire. I think it's kind of the role he was born to play in some ways. And he's very clearly channeling Bela Lugosi, even though I read after I watched The Vampire's Kiss, which I assume both of you have seen. I think we talked about it a little bit. Yeah, I read afterwards that he's kind of more taken with the Nosferatu Max Schreck version of a vampire. He's clearly doing sort of a Bela Lugosi in this movie, but he's doing it really fucking well. And this isn't necessarily something I say that much. I felt like this movie needed more Nicolas Cage.
I will definitely agree with you there. Not that that's any big surprise. Pretty much Nicolas Cage could be in every second of a film, and I'd be like, a little more Nicolas Cage would have been nice, because that's just me. I do think I think one of the things about this film is I believe if everyone else sucked and you took everything else out of the equation and it was just Nicolas Cage delivering that Dracula performance, it would still be worth the price of admission for me. I might be disappointed. I might be like, Nicolas Cage deserved a better film for this level of performance, which I have heard that criticism, because he is bringing it so hard and he's so fucking good. And he's so like, he's just transcendent in his performance that I think he alone, if everything else was garbage, I would still probably like be here defending this film and be like, okay, but I'm going to give you that this doesn't work and this doesn't work and this person sucked and the writing was bad and the directing was bad and blah, blah, blah. But still, you should watch it just to see Nicolas Cage. Like, just tune in to see his performance because it's that good and it's worth it. I do think it was smart of them to use him sparingly because I think it makes him more effective. But I will say that every second he was on the screen was an absolute fucking delight. And I will go on to add to that and say that every scene that he shared with Nicholas Hoult was my absolute favorite. Like, I thought those two had such phenomenal chemistry and played off of each other so well, that I could have used more of. I wish, if I was going to have a criticism, I wish there was more of that in the relationship between those two than the relationship between like Renfield and Awkwafina's character, or maybe less of the sort of crime stuff, even though I did enjoy some of that. And I think Ben Schwartz was phenomenal in this as well. I think he's super fun. I could have used more of the Renfield Dracula relationship for sure.
Steph, I wish you could have seen me punching the air triumphantly when you said that, because I completely agree with you. I think, I love Ben Schwartz. I'm a Parks and Rec girl all the way through. But for me, the part of the story that worked the least was the kind of like crime family cop story. And I thought that, like you said, Nicholas Hoult and Nicolas Cage had really great chemistry. And I thought you've got one of the great kind of like queer, gender bending characters in horror. And you're introducing kind of the idea of like a toxic relationship. And the fact that you're not playing up like more of the kind of homoeroticism angle feels like a really wasted opportunity to me. Bram Stoker was famously gay and had a relationship with Oscar Wilde, and you can see parts of that in the text. And it felt like a really good chance to kind of like reclaim Dracula as this like queer icon. And I was a little disappointed they didn't do that, because I felt like both of these actors feel like they're game for it to me. And this is a campy, it's already kind of campy, and why not go that direction instead of trying to shoehorn in this? Nothing against Awkwafina, she's lovely, but like they didn't have the same spark, I didn't think, as Nick Cage and Nicholas Hoult did when they were on screen together. And there wasn't this history that you felt like, oh, there's a complicated thing going on between these two characters. And I would have really loved to have seen that explored a little bit more.
I think the only reason that you have, and I get it from a screenwriting perspective, the only reason that you have Awkwafina's character, because let's face it, like, I think she's adorable, and I know a lot of people do not like her. I think I have no problem with her at all. I thought she was perfectly fine and good in this film. But I wouldn't sit here and say that she had like amazing chemistry with Nicholas Hoult, or that they like lit up the screen when they were together. I didn't hate the scenes they were in, but I also wasn't like, oh, holy shit, more of this, please. But I think she needs to exist because the whole sort of concept of this film is to get Renfield out of his toxic relationship. And so he is, she's sort of representing like, this is what a healthy relationship could be like. This is what a normal boundaries are. This is what a normal life would look like. And sort of being the driver of that change within him. Now, certainly, I'm sure you could have like found another way to do that or written that differently. But I think that's really the whole reason she exists. I do think there is a lot of implied. I don't think they play it up as much as would have been fun to see. There is a lot of implied, like they do have this, Renfield and Dracula do have this sort of intense relationship and bond and intimacy that you can really read as homoerotic if you would like to, or choose not to, really depending on how you want to perceive it. But Awkwafina is sort of representing the like air quotes normal relationship, and that's why her character exists, and what that's sort of the impetus for Renfield being like, okay, this is bad for me. This is bad.
I agree with you. And I think that both Nicholas Hoult and Aquafina do a lot of work towards making that work. I think that they're cute and they're sweet, but I also kind of just didn't care about them. And I know that sounds terrible, but like I was like way more interested in like dealing with the idea of like, well, and this, I'm sorry, I'm going to go kind of like a little bit on a tangent here. And I'm interested in hearing you guys' thoughts, but in the book, and to use a kind of, I think, appropriate parallel in What We Do in the Shadows. Do you guys watch that show?
Yeah.
Hell yes.
Okay. The idea of the familiar is that they are the familiar because the promise is given that they will be turned into a vampire. I didn't quite understand, and maybe I just missed it, and please feel free to tell me if I did, what Renfield's reason for being loyal to Dracula all these years was. Because it doesn't seem like he wants to become a vampire. And I return to my question of what exactly is he? I don't entirely understand what he's supposed to be in this movie. Like something between a vampire and a human, but he's kind of basically a vampire, just one that exists off of bugs instead of human blood. Like I didn't quite get what he was supposed to be.
So
but didn't understand what his motivation was.
I'm gonna answer that, and I'm gonna turn it over to Jack because I want Jack to like share some of his thoughts about what worked and what didn't. We've been monopolizing the conversation.
So sorry.
No, it's not your fault, and it's my fault too because like
no, you guys are good. I could talk about this film all day long.
But let me answer that question. So they talk about how Dracula has this uncanny ability to basically peer into your soul and know exactly what you need when you need it and what is going to appeal to you most. So he basically preys on whatever your secret desires or insecurities are. And when Renfield came to him, he was really looking for, like, he wanted to make something of his life. He wanted to be successful. He thought that he needed to be a better provider for his family. He thought he needed to make more money and be a bigger deal. And he had kind of this ego, and Dracula played to that. And he basically manipulated him and said, like, listen, like, come with me and you'll have all your wildest dreams. You'll have everything you ever wanted, which is why, like, you see that scene where when he's dealing with Ben Schwartz, there's a different sort of manipulation tactic there. And he does the same thing with Aquafina and Renfield kind of calls us out. He's like, look, this is what he does. He like knows what you want and he preys on that. And he basically manipulates you and gets you to basically give your soul to him in exchange. It's basically like making a deal with the devil is the best like equation I can make. It's like you're going to sell your soul for whatever you want most. And that's what Renfield has sold his soul. And by the time he kind of realized what had happened, it's too late. Like once you're in, which is the sort of toxic relationship nature of this, is that like he can't get out. He can't extract himself. He's miserable. He's not happy. He's lost everything. He's lost his family. But now he's stuck. Like, what's he going to do? Because Renfield like has him, you know, in a position of like ultimate control. So I think for me, that's when we talk about motivation. It's like, no, he doesn't want to be there. He's like, he fucked up. He made a deal with the devil and now he's stuck.
Well, I look at it like this way. So because they lead into this, and there's a conversation near the end of the movie where Renfield and Aquafina are having their conversation, and he's explaining exactly that. Like, this is what he does. And to put it in the context of the film, you know, it's very much that abuser mentality, that trauma response, the gaslighting. I mean, it really is this power of making you feel like you're the center of the universe. And then when you take that leap and you jump into that relationship, and then all of a sudden it turns out that's not true. And I think that really kind of cuts to the core of their relationship, because I think, you know, when he was up and coming as a lawyer, that is exactly what he wanted. He thought he wanted power and prestige and wealth, and all he had to do was make this one deal with this eccentric old count and he was set. And, you know, and Dracula preyed upon that, just like a real life abuser will prey upon the things that you're desperate for the most. Somehow they just know. Now, you know, with Dracula, obviously we can say it's a supernatural thing where he can sense your dark desires and your deepest desires and fears, and can manipulate those, where people in real life, somehow they just weed it out of you and they figure it out and they trap you in it. It's a trap of your own making in a sense. And so that to me was kind of the core concept of the movie, you know, is to how do you break out of that cycle of dependency? And I think they did a good job with that. I think that was the relationship between Renfield and Aquafina a little vanilla? Yeah, it was, you know, but I think that was by design. they didn't have the best chemistry, but I think it worked in the context of the film proper to really give that sense that, yeah, I mean, he thought he was getting something out of it. He thought he was going to make something better for himself. And then he's stuck in that trauma response where it's, you try to escape and they pull you back, and you try to escape and they pull you back. Only instead of happening over the course of weeks or months or years, like a normal relationship, it happens over the course of decades for this relationship, and in that regard, to me, I think they nailed it very well. And that's what I wanted more of in this film. I wanted more of that, because that's really interesting commentary that you can make upon, a bunch of relationships and a bunch of trauma that people have today. And I thought it would be really brave of this movie to take that concept, tie it to a horror concept, and smash those two together and really, really say something. And that's the one kind of frustrating part for me, is that they really didn't do that. They had all the opportunity. They touch on it, they allude to it, and they do a very good job of discussing it and talking about it, but they never really make that tie. And I was really, I was a little upset by that, because I thought this would have been a much better film for it.
I agree with you, Jack. I think you made a lot of really, really good points in what you just said. I don't mean to tie it back to what I just said, but I'm gonna, and I'm sorry, but that's just who I am. I think that kind of goes back to what I was saying about wanting it to be a little bit more overtly queer, to be honest. I think the interesting and the moving and relatable component is the idea of the abuser who uses their knowledge of you to keep you down and to keep you from being the person you want to be. And I think that's really great. And I wish they'd have gone more full in on that. Because nothing against Aquafina, but the whole crime family thing just kind of left me a little bit tepid. And it felt to me like, as a result, these very interesting threads of Renfield figuring himself out and separating from this noxious, horrible relationship were left underserved in a way that I would have really liked to have seen them explore. And also in a way that, like, as I stated, I think I could have used more Nicolas Cage in this movie. And I'm always hesitant to say that, because I love Nick Cage, but I do think that sometimes with him, a little goes a long way. In this particular case, I thought he really pulled his performance into the exact right level. It was exactly where it should be. And so I could have used more. And I agree with you, Steph, that, like, it was smart to not overuse him, but I still feel like maybe a little bit more would have been good, and just a little bit more to give us a sense of their relationship, because they did have good chemistry. They did have, and also, if you're supposed to accept that these are two people who have been together for hundreds of years, I think you need maybe just a little bit more to see why. Especially with the caveat that, like, you're supposed to feel like maybe the, what do they call it when vampires hypnotize you?
Glamour.
Thank you. Yes. The glamour is supposed to be a little bit gone. There's certainly an element of self-awareness, I felt, with Renfield, where he's supposed to be starting to feel like, why am I doing this? And maybe showing them together a little bit more would have helped towards that, especially since it does show that it's beholden to the old lore by using the footage of the Bela Lugosi Dracula and inserting Nicholas Hoult and Nicolas Cage into that, taking out the original actors and putting them in. It makes you feel like, okay, well, we're very specifically hearkening back to this version of Dracula. At least I thought that. And I liked that footage. I thought it was really cool. I felt like it set a mood. It was dope. But then it feels like, okay, we're adhering to that idea of Dracula. I felt like there was a moment about 2/3 of the way through the movie where they established that people in this world know who Dracula is, that I was truly shocked by. Because I thought we were dealing in a world where, like, Dracula just exists and it's on the side and nobody knows who that is, versus the idea that, like, there's a Dracula book and a Dracula movie, which is kind of suggested when he tells Aquafina, like, oh, I work for Dracula. And she's like, Dracula? What? And I felt like, okay, so this is actually a pretty big revelation that, like, people know who Dracula is, that this is a world where Dracula is a thing, but it doesn't serve any purpose. And I wasn't quite sure why that was there at all. All of which is just to say, I would have been very happy with this movie, with no shade towards Awkwafina or Ben Schwartz, who I love, if they had just cut those subplots and had it be mostly Renfield trying to strike out on his own, create a new life, and Dracula continually pulling him back in. Throwing it back to you guys.
Yeah, I mean, I think that is part of the challenge with this film. And, I'm going to give you that part of the weakness of this film and where the criticism is fair is that there's about 4 really good movies in this film, all kind of mashed together. And the whole reason I think the crime family subplot exists is to give you an excuse to have a shit ton of really cool action scenes, which was obviously very important to the filmmakers, that we get a lot of that nutty, over the top, batshit crazy fighting. And you really couldn't have had that without, some sort of subplot that makes that make sense. So that's the reason they exist. And, there's a love story to really serve as a counter to the relationship between Renfield and Dracula. So I think, and to your point, Kelly, I think that what you described is a really interesting film, but it's a totally different kind of film. And I think it would have worked great to have done a more serious film that was a little bit more reflective, that actually really took the analogy of the toxic relationship even further and made it a little bit more sort of serious and more thoughtful. I think that the idea of that analogy is super, super smart and really fun and cool and interesting. And yeah, you could have done so much with it. But again, I think that it would have been a different kind of film, one that I would have showed up for and watched just as hard as this one. You also could have leaned way more into the horror aspects or the camp aspects, or really any of the aspects that are in this film. And I think as a standalone, it also would have worked great. This film is trying to do a whole lot, and some of it really, really works, and some of it feels a little shoehorned, and some of it feels a little too much, or a little bit really kind of fucks with the tonal balance of the film. So I think that's the challenge. But so I guess that's a long-winded way of saying you're not wrong, but I think that had they done what you're suggesting, it would have been a totally different kind of film, which would have also been super, super interesting. But then we would have had to lose a lot of the silliness and the action and all that stuff that makes it the film that it is now.
This isn't a knock
100%.
against graphic novels. This isn't a knock against Robert Kirkman at all, but I think this is also very indicative of, this is Robert Kirkman's writing. This is somebody who writes comic books. This is somebody who writes graphic novels. And so it feels like, if you will, this would have worked almost. The tonal shifts and the randomness is exactly what comic books and graphic novels bring. If you've ever read comics or graphic novels, they, except for some of the more well-known established ones by Gaiman or whatever, this is how they play out. It's all kind of soap opera-ish, if you will. It's all very over the top. And then they have these weird vanilla moments. And it really is kind of a comic book strip or a graphic novel strip writ large on the screen. And that's exactly how it plays out. So again, I'm not knocking the mediums by any means. But I think that's it's what you get when you have somebody who writes these kind of stories, write this story. It's, and how do you adapt that to a film,
I 100% agree with you, Jack. I think you're absolutely right. What you can do in a few panels is really different than what you can do in a few scenes. But I am genuinely curious about what you would both say to this, because this was the thing I kept going back to. Have you both read the book? Dracula?
Dracula? Oh, yeah, of course.
Yes.
Okay. So then you both know, I'm sure most of the people who are listening to this know, that Renfield's whole thing in the book is that he eats the bugs because he's delusional, because he feels like this is a way of taking in a life force. And it's nothing really. He's just delusional. I don't mean to beat a dead horse, but I'm truly curious because I kept finding myself going back to this question over and over and over again. In this movie, what is Renfield? He's not a vampire, obviously, but he's not human. bugs give him power? Is he a superhero? Like, I'm not even trying to be like snarky or coy. I'm asking, what is this character? Because I could not make heads or tails of it. And then at the end, when Schwartz has had Dracula turn all of his men into other Renfields, I was still like, I don't know what we're dealing with here. Like, we're not dealing with vampires, apparently, but like, we're dealing with something that's more than human, but I don't know, like, especially with the caveat that you introduced the concept of the Bela Lugosi Dracula movie early in, which has rules. You're defying those rules now. So like, what is this new thing? Not judgy necessarily. I'm just genuinely curious. What is a Renfield?
Jack, do you want to take that, or do you want me to take my?
Well, that's the thing, is that's one of the problems I have with the movie, is I don't know, because again, in a comic book, the bugs would be his super serum, and he takes that, and all of a sudden, boom, he's super powered, and then so that's where the tonal disconnects to me really hit. And again, I love the individual pieces of this movie. I love action. I love action movies, and so I love it when a movie can do action scenes very well. And so all the scenes where Teddy and his henchmen are now also Renfields, are also familiars, and they have this heightened sense of power and stuff. And the movie goes full Matrix for a minute, like it really does, with all these gravity defying stunts, and everybody's over the top and spinning and flipping and all this stuff. And it's like, now it's a kung fu film, and it was, I really did struggle a little bit with that same thing. What is he doing? Because you're right, there's rules to this. Like, he cannot enter a structure without being invited, which I thought was kind of a cool nod when Renfield has that mat, the doormat that says, "Welcome, come on in," or something, and he looks at it, and Dracula comes, he's like, "Oh shit," and I thought that was really cool. A really cool nod to the traditional lore of vampires, if you will, not the sparkly motherfuckers that can be out in the sunlight and play baseball, but the real core crux of the vampire logic and lore. And then you're right, at that point, because if you look at the definition of a familiar, it's usually just kind of a mindless slave in traditional sense. And in this movie, he basically is a superhero.
Oh, they do touch on this in the film. Like, Renfield indicates that he has been gifted with some of Dracula's powers. And so the way I read it is like, he's not a vampire. Like, he obviously doesn't follow all the same, tropes and things. Like, he can go where he wants to go in the daytime. He can enter without being invited. So he's not a vampire. But he has been infused with Dracula powers. Like, they reference that. He says that a few times. And so, and the way that gets activated is by him eating these bugs, which I think is just like kind of a fun subversion of the original trope, and just putting a new spin on it. That and I think that that's done intentionally to be like, he straddles both worlds. And that's part of the confrontation that he has with Dracula, because Dracula is like, you want to give up all of this and you want to go be with these like fucking gross humans. Why? And he's like, because that's what I am. Like, I am a human, and I do have humanity. And so this world, as fucked up as it may be, is my world. This is where I belong. And they have that conflict, because Dracula's basically like, because you straddle both worlds, you really have a choice. You can live in this world of these immortal vampires, or you can live in the human world. You obviously can't do both because it's too much of a conflict. But because he's like, he hasn't been turned, he is still human, but he has these same powers. He can live in either world. And that's where it comes down to the choice of like, where he is going to live and where he is going to thrive. And that's
the self-fulfilling prophecy of the crux of the problem is that, and I'm not saying you're wrong or disagreeing, but it's you can live in this world or you can live in their world. And it's like, well, motherfucker, you could have made me live in your world 100 years ago. And yet here I am,
exactly,
not allowed to do that. I still have to live in their world in order to bring you what you need. And that's kind of almost contradictory and a little, and I'm not saying that that's
fuck. Like, he's not doing this to be fair, right, and to be like,
I agree.
What's the best thing? He's doing what's best for him as Dracula,
of
which
course.
That's why he's creating the scenario of like, you're powerful enough to do what you need to do for me, but you can't be you can't be my level of power because I'm Dracula. I'm a fucking narcissist. I've got to be in control. So I still have to keep you down, and you still have to be my minion, and you still have to be lesser than me. But you need to be powerful enough to do my bidding. So like, it's intentionally fucked up and manipulative and screwed up.
I have a couple of notes.
Okay.
On what you said, Steph, because I think that you made a number of incredibly valid points, and I think as is often the point with guilty pleasures, I think you did a little bit more work for the movie than the movie did for itself. I truly and genuinely, unironically love your enthusiasm for these movies, and it makes me really happy to hear somebody defending them with so much like fervor and genuine passion. It's great to hear. I am always happier to hear people loving movies than hating them. Because I didn't hate this movie. There were some things that I felt didn't work. And I think to me, there should have been an inciting incident to maybe set Renfield on this path of like, I don't know, he needed to see something. He needed to see Dracula, I don't know, drink the blood of his ancestor or something to put him on this path. Because the thing that we as an audience have to reconcile with is that for hundreds of years, Renfield had no problem with doing any of this. Like, maybe we're supposed to sort of tacitly understand that he was somewhat conflicted, but it's not there. It's not in the text. And at the end of the day, we know what the movie tells us and we can fill in the blanks, but like, I need something to be the thing that sets off him thinking, nope, I'm not interested in this anymore. I will go back to this 1,000 times and I'm so sorry. And you can all tell me to shut the fuck up. I just have so much trouble with understanding what the hell Renfield is supposed to be. I don't get it. It's a problem for me. And that might be partially, honestly, just because I'm such a Dracula fan. Like, I come at this from a place of loving Bram Stoker's Dracula, the book, and loving Bram Stoker's Dracula, the Francis Ford Coppola movie, where Tom Waits is just out of his gourd nuts. And most versions of Renfield are, it's supposed to be that he's kind of insane, and the madness is the thing that makes him interesting. And I love Nicholas Hoult, but he plays him as more like milquetoast, more a character who's sort of beaten down versus somebody who's totally fucking batshit crazy. And that's fine. I like taking a different approach, but what's on?
Can I ask you a question? I'm sorry to interrupt, but
please. No, interrupt away.
Well, and this is gonna go back to me doing more work than the film, which is a fair criticism. My question for you is, if you weren't seeing the world through Renfield's eyes, and if Renfield was just a side character and Dracula was our hero or our main focus, you're on the outside looking in. And you didn't know about any of this stuff about what was real or what wasn't. If Renfield tried to explain his perspective and his situation, which you do get a little of this when he's trying to like first interact with Awkwafina, would you not think he was absolutely insane? Like, no matter how like charming and sweet he seems, you'd be like, you're out of your fucking gourd, dude. What the hell?
To be clear, that's a really aggressively good point, Steph. That's great. And I think you're right. I think that anybody, like, although with the caveat that this is a movie that seems to suggest that people understand that Dracula is a real person, like, she accepts it pretty quickly, quicker than I think I would. To be fair, I think that if somebody told me, like, in the world we live in, I work with Dracula, I'd be like, oh, congratulations on being really crazy. Good for you. But I think you make a valid point. It complicates things for certain. Jack, what do you think?
Well, and that's the thing is that, you know, there's very different definitions of crazy, right? You've got people who are absolute nutters, and then you've got people who seem very, very normal and are very eloquent and very calm about it. And, you know, but there's neurosis there, there's craziness there, you know, whatever you want to call it, there's, you know, sociopath, whatever. It's so you've got two different sides of a coin. And of course, you know, in traditional cinema, And what we've been groomed to expect is that if you're crazy, then you're stark, raving, mad, crazy, right? That's what we were all grown up with in old cinema. It was, you know, the nut house and everybody screaming and shrieking and freaking the fuck out. And as we know, that's not necessarily the case. Yes, there sure are those brands of crazy, you know, but then there's also those brands who are very normal appearing, very sweet, very considerate, and yet they're off their motherfucking rockers, you know. And so I don't know, in this case, it is a struggle because you're right. If somebody were to sit down and say, hey, I have something to tell you, I am a minion of Dracula, he's actually real, and it's like, oh, okay, Dracula, like the legend Dracula, you know, yeah, I'd be like, oh, this guy is fucking crazy, you know. So, but I don't know, again, it's one of those things where what kind of crazy are we talking about? You know, somebody who's actually legitimately believing this, or somebody who is completely off their rocker, and you would not want to be in a room with them for 2 seconds. And that's the Tom Waits kind of crazy, is you don't want to be anywhere near that guy at all. Where like Nicholas Hoult, I'd be like, you know what? That's kind of fucking nutty, but hey, let's talk about this because you're really fun to talk to. Let's delve into this. Explain to me.
I don't
think
he would. I think if that was a stranger that he didn't know and he was like, yeah, I'm a minion of Dracula and I have powers and I eat bugs and he'd be like, oh, that's cute. And then you'd be like, I'm going to exit the room as quickly as possible. Like, you're not going to want to be buds with this dude. You're going to think he's...
In real life, he's a fiend puff. Like that, no, that guy doesn't scare me at all. Like, we're an unhinged...
He might not scare you, but you'd be like, you obviously have mental problems. Like, you are in a severe state of delulu that is, like, concerning.
But, you know, don't we all have issues?
I agree with you, Steph, but I also disagree with you, which is a complicated question.
Okay.
Because I absolutely agree that, like, no matter how cute and endearing, if somebody says the craziest thing possible, you still are like, oh no, you're insane. However, in the world of a sort of filmic language, by making him a first person narrator and making him like so cute and putting him in Cosby sweaters as the movie progresses, like everything that's done is done to make him increasingly less threatening, even though we see him like ripping arms off of people, which, boy, I've got some stuff to say about that. A lot of it's done to make him feel really relatable, almost like to make him feel like, oh no, this is somebody I absolutely would trust. And to the speed, the unbelievable speed with which Awkwafina goes from, I've just seen you murder people, not casually kill and not kill in self-defense, but like actually murder people brutally, to being like, no, you're a good guy, suggests that it wants us, the movie wants us to feel like, no, he's good. It's okay. You can like Renfield. He's a good guy. You don't have to think about him as crazy because he's doing nice things for nice people. It's fine.
Well, I mean, I think it would be different if she saw him like brutally murder a bunch of innocent people, but
she sees him brutally murdering terrible people. And it's still like, I know they're terrible people, but it is unspeakably brutal. He rips a person's face off.
Sure,
like he actually...
They're trying to kill. Like, they are not good people. They are murderous people who have come there with the only intent of killing. So
I know, but the way he kills them is so bananas. It's not like, oh no, it's in self-defense. Yeah. It's like, I'm ripping your arms off and then poking you in the eyes, Stooges style. It is next level violence.
Because there's defending yourself, and then there's going way above and beyond and causing all sorts of carnage. And in the real world, that's exactly right. You shoot somebody in self-defense, you fire once and they're down, okay, done. If you shoot them a bunch of times and then rip off their arm and use that to beat their cohort with,
you're taking pleasure
something else entirely. Yeah, it's true. You're not wrong. That's very, very true. Of course, this whole movie is really problematic on that level anyways. And I have to wonder how the New Orleans Police Department feels about their depiction in this movie, because it seems like everybody other than Rebecca, her sister, and her father is completely corrupt, you know, and they're just gunning down cops left and right. Like, and I do struggle with that aspect of a movie where, you know, yes, obviously these cops are probably on the take, or they're being told, hey, these guys are dangerous. Maybe they don't know. Maybe they just think they're dangerous and they're not on the take. But every single cop that they come in contact with also gets killed in relatively brutal fashion. And there's a little bit of struggle with that, because even if they're defending themselves. And in no world is that okay. And in no world are they going to be like, oh, well, everything's fine now. You're good. It's okay. You just killed the entire New Orleans police department, but you're fine. It's totally understandable. It was like, ooh,
yeah,
a little much.
I'm with
much.
you, Jack,
and I think
I have so sorry. We keep trying to talk over each other, and it's going exactly as well as one would expect it to. I have no particular love for the cops. Truly, I'm not a police fan as a rule. But the idea that like Aquafina is the one good cop in New Orleans, and that like she'd be able to do the shit she does and not have like, I don't know, an internal review that ended with her getting like stone cold the electric chair is bonkers to me.
Yeah. It's movie
like
logic.
Next level crazy.
Yeah. Yeah, that's it. And I do struggle with that kind of movie logic. I really actually kind of hate that kind of movie logic, because at the end of the day, there's really no consequence. The heroes are the heroes. Hurrah! And it's like, but wait a minute. Like, what about all this carnage that they were directly involved with, and you could basically say instigated? Sure, I mean, it has to happen for the movie to happen. Totally get it. They have to have the final confrontation. Totally get it. But it's, it is one of those things where it's just that kind of stuff in all these films. It doesn't matter what kind of film. It's every fucking film just gets swept under the rug. Like, oh, it's okay. Don't worry about it. There is no consequence outside of the confines of the film.
You guys and your obsession with logic in these films is like,
and I'm okay with a lack of with a little bit of a lack of logic. I am. I mean, sometimes logic needs to lead. But
it is, to your point,
Lord.
It is a comic book movie. It is intentionally a comic book movie, and I don't know. For me, we've had this conversation multiple times. It's pretty easy for me to just like, okay, I'm gonna check certain. If I'm already accepting there's a world where the supernatural exists and Dracula exists, and a Renfield with superpower exists, then like I'm pretty on board with most everything else, because I'm like, well, that's already suspending my disbelief in such, like, we're exited the world of like our current reality and what we understand to be real and factual, and like, what if our whole paradigm shifted and everything was completely different than how it is now? Like, what else would change? Like, would we have the same laws, the same like criminal justice system, the same like way of being? If the supernatural was real? Probably not. Everything would change.
Hang on, Steph.
Yeah.
Hang on. I want to ask you a question, and I want to ask this question to Kelly too. So you said something very interesting, and it always kind of makes me wag my tail in the fact that you said, if the supernatural exists. Now, obviously there's varying levels, right? Because we're talking about a movie where Dracula is real and where the drinking of blood gives powers and sunlight will burn him to a crisp. But that statement right there kind of leads me to a question that I want to ask you both is, do you have any actual experiences, definitive experiences with the supernatural? Because I do. And so when somebody says, well, if the supernatural were real, well, I believe wholeheartedly that it is real, but I also believe in the basic tenets of logic, if you will, which creates an interesting dichotomy, but things behave a certain way. Certain things do not, and that's okay. And not everything needs to have an answer, but it's that question in a general context, not necessarily in this movie context, is really interesting to me, because
it's the
again,
difference.
I believe wholeheartedly that it is real because I have had experiences and my family has had experiences with it.
Sure.
So it to me is like, oh, the supernatural is a thing, but then logic is also a thing.
It's the difference for me when I say that. There's a difference between, okay, let's say we all accept the idea that there's probably life on another planet and that potentially there's government cover up of that life and potentially we've been visited. Like if let's say across the board we all accepted that, that's still different than like, oh my God, there's an alien invasion right now and there are literal aliens and they are making their presence known. Like that would fundamentally change everything immediately. If we had that sort of interaction. There's a difference between like a lot of people are very much like, oh, obviously there's a God and obviously everything in the Bible is true. And there's plenty of people who don't believe that. But for the people that do, that is a fundamental reality. That is something that they are like, this exists. You can't tell me it doesn't exist. I believe this wholeheartedly, even if there are certain things that like do not align with our understanding of the universe as we know it today and what we know about science. It doesn't really align with everything that's in the Bible. Just people are still like, nope, I believe in science, but I also believe in God, and that's 100%. That's still different than if Jesus came down right now and said, I'm here, and made his presence known to everyone and said, like, okay, guys, like, end times is here, it's happening. That would fundamentally change everything. So the idea of like, I believe this is real and I've had personal experience is very different than like, okay, now we are forced as an entire society to deal with the reality of this and the ramifications. Kelly, you go.
I think that's I think you said a very well worded version of kind of what I would want to say, which is that I am very northeastern pragmatic, which means that no matter how weird the thing is that happens, I tend to think there's a scientific explanation for this. I wish I could quote it precisely, but there's a quote in an Anne Rice book where she says something along the lines of, despite the basic Occam's razor of the most obvious answer is the right answer, humans will go out of their way to pick an answer that fits their understanding of the universe. So even if the logical thing is the obvious thing, if it doesn't fit with what we perceive as reality, we tend to cancel it out. And I've got that. I am very northeastern pragmatist. My partner is from Kentucky, and they are much more inclined to think like, why are you being so stupid? Like the weird motion sensitive skeleton in your house went off at 4 a.m, even though nobody passed it. Doesn't that tell you something? And there's a part of my brain that's very much like, yeah, you're 100% right. I don't know why my brain refuses to accept that. But with that in mind, not one goddamn thing in Renfield strikes me as this is a supernatural thing that I should be accepting of. My sister-in-law is Romanian, as in born in Romania and came over from Romania. So she has some very, very specific and, unique ideas on vampires and Vlad. And they would not buy any of this bullshit because it's very, very silly. And I don't have a problem with silly. I think silly is absolutely fine. And, I'm risking venturing into a totally different, neighborhood, which is things that I genuinely liked about this movie. And we can come back to that at a point, but, I've absolutely 100% lost track of what the question was. I'm so sorry, Jack. What was the question?
No. It was just questioning about the supernatural and how it's.
Oh yeah. Well, the long and way too long, and I'm so sorry, guys. I deeply apologize. Is that I try to remain open to the possibility with the natural pragmatism, and nothing at all in this movie feels like it's potentially real to me. Not one.
Well, no.
Thing.
No, and I don't think it was supposed to be. Again, this is a comic book movie writ large, and a very, like you said, silly in a way retelling of the Dracula or continuation, I guess.
Like it felt like I know I said serving too many masters, but I really meant it. Like I just feel like they were trying to throw so many things at the wall in an attempt to, I guess, draw in the biggest audience or whatever. But like, as a result, I felt like no one story was serviced as well as it should have been.
And I think that's what ultimately doomed this movie is I think if you watch the trailers and you see it, it is even the trailers are a little tonally off. And I think that
inconsistent. Yeah.
Yeah, very. And then it leaves audiences an alert. Like as much as I love Nick Cage's Dracula, and I absolutely fucking love Nick Cage's Dracula.
He was really fun. He was great.
Yeah, he was. But what movie am I getting? Because this is not
right.
And I don't want to I don't ever want to be one of those people that's like, because I fucking hate these people that it's like not My Little Mermaid because she's black. I don't care what color you are. Don't matter to me. But it is almost kind of like that with Not My Dracula because it's like, okay, I'm fine with taking risks. I'm fine with trying new things, but this is not. I don't know. To me, like you asked a good a good question. If you took Dracula out of this movie, what is this movie? And it's
Well,
like,
can I say one thing there? I
Of
think
course.
part of what I love about this movie, and I think makes it so fucking charming, is that we've had so many retellings of Dracula and variations of Dracula, and certainly not even just Dracula, but the vampire myth in and of itself. And to have a film that is centered on not Dracula, it is about Renfield. Dracula just exists to further Renfield's story. He is not the central figure. He's not the main hero. He's not the main focus. He's not what matters. What matters is Renfield's journey. And that's who we're following. And so I think a lot of the sort of, sometimes people being disappointed in this are like, well, this isn't my Dracula. Well, this isn't even a Dracula story. He's just in this universe. This is a Renfield story. And I also don't think, like, we've had what we consider perfect renditions of Dracula, regardless of, and we may all have a different take on that, or we may all agree. But we don't need to see it again. Like, we don't need that rehash. We don't need to relitigate what's already like been deemed perfect. This is a different Dracula, a different approach to the story, a different approach to the lore. And like, you can love that or not love it. It can be something that works for you or doesn't, but I don't think it's like, well, this isn't my Dracula. I think it's like, well, this is a different interpretation. It does nothing to, in my opinion, take anything away from what has worked in the past or what is meaningful and important to us or where our origin story is or any of that stuff. This is just another layer and another addition to a vast, vast universe that we can either embrace or choose not to, and that's completely fine.
I think that's a really good point, Steph. I think you're right. It doesn't take anything away from the lore. And I think I completely agree with you. Honestly, I didn't hate this movie. I have things that I want. I'm sort of saving them until the end of my good stuff. I feel like I'm front loading my criticisms, so that I can put the things that I liked at the end. But I think there's a lot of really charming, likable things about this movie. I think the kind of complicated thing comes that Nicolas Cage is so compelling and so riveting when he's on stage that on screen, you kind of want it to be a Dracula movie, even though it's a Renfield movie. You kind of just want it to. I mean, I talked to my mom about it afterwards to go back to. And what she kept going back to was like, wasn't it cool, that sequence where Dracula like levitated over the self-help group? That was really cool, right? And like, yeah, it is really cool because Nicolas Cage was so committed to that performance and he was so watchable and so engaging. And that's the thing about Dracula. Like, usually if you're playing any variation on that character, you are the most riveting person on the screen. I am a huge fan of Shadow of the Vampire, which is extremely hard to find. I assume you've both seen it, with Willem Dafoe. It's a great movie, but it's really hard to find. But while Willem Dafoe is on the screen, he's like the only thing you see. And John Malkovich is in that movie. He's an absolutely charismatic, magnetic actor. And still, the thing you focus on is the sort of Dracula stand-in. And just how it is with Dracula movies. You tend to be drawn to whoever the Dracula is, as I stated, I love the Francis Ford Coppola movie. And if you asked me how much I love Anthony Hopkins, I would tell you a lot, but it's Gary Oldman who draws you.
Right.
So I feel like anytime you have that character, anytime you have the Dracula character, he's going to be the most riveting aspect of what is on the screen. And I think it's to Nicolas Cage's credit that he continues that legacy. It's just that then it complicates the story that we're presented with. It's a double-edged
sword, because as soon as you put Dracula, as soon as you put Nicolas Cage as Dracula, I know it's a Renfield movie, but it becomes a Dracula movie because it becomes a Nicolas Cage movie. Yep.
Because he's so charming in a way and so riveting. And even when he's being just stone cold evil, you're like, wow, this is a great role for Nicolas Cage.
Yes,
he's doing great work. And also the makeup's fantastic. I don't know how much of it was practical, but I'm assuming a lot of it, and it looks amazing.
It does.
No, you're not wrong. I mean, I think most people, if you're like people see this as a Dracula movie and they see this as a Nicolas Cage vehicle. And I certainly do as well. I think it is to the credit of the film, though, that as charismatic as Nicolas Cage is, and he certainly is, and I obviously think he's perfect, Nicholas Hoult very much holds his own and very much owns every scene he's in and makes this, like, he's very memorable. It's not like you leave just going, where I think some of the other films you guys talk about, you pretty much leave only really caring about or focusing on one character, which is Dracula. I think at least in this film, you definitely, I think, for the most part, care about and are invested in Renfield as well, even though Renfield is a very uninteresting character compared to Dracula and could easily just like blend into the background and not matter at all. And I think that he does matter, and he is fascinating, and seeing his perspective is fascinating, in my personal opinion. And I think they did a nice job of that. Yeah. I don't think that's easy to do.
In fact, I kind of wanted them to be a little more about him and his complications. And that's the only thing that I really struggle with the Renfield character, because Nicholas Hoult is fantastic. And I mean, I love everything that he's in. And he does do a very good job. But it's also, if it's a Renfield movie, I wanted more Renfield. I wanted more of that internal struggle, because we don't ever, he talks about it and you see it kind of briefly, but the movie doesn't really dive into it. And maybe they didn't want to. Maybe they wanted to keep it very light and airy, in which case they succeeded. But that's kind of what I wanted is, you have a character who realistically should be very complex. I mean, really.
Yes.
He is a mortal who has basically not been mortal for 100 years. And the toll that takes, I think, and I don't, it's fine that movies want to stand on their own. I don't think they need to be servants to other things. So let me in, where that whole relationship between the vampire and her old servant, and like there's so much history there, and it's sad and it's depressing, and or let the right one in. Sorry, and this movie I think this movie could have done that a little more, even without necessarily losing the core of what it was trying to be, because it is a Renfield movie. So let's get more of him and the things that have happened over this span of decades that it just kind of glosses over. And I do struggle because Kelly made a very good point. Why now? Like, he's in a support group, and that's the thing that kickstarts his need to be good. There was nothing else in that span of 97 years that has changed anything. Really? Like, this is his one moment of...
I think he has been isolated for humanity for that century. He has really it's been him and Dracula, and he has lost touch with his humanity, and he has been immersed in this world of not human. And I think, he didn't seek out that support group. He stumbled into it. They even mentioned he was like looking for victims for Dracula, and he stumbled into it. And it was the first time that he met people who were like him in some way. Because he's not, as a familiar, he's not going to run into a bunch of other familiars. It's not like in What We Do in the Shadows, where there's like a club and there's a bunch of them and they all like hang out. He's alone, and he has nobody to talk to. He has nobody that gets his situation. This is the first time that he even realizes, like, shit, am I in a toxic relationship? Like, is this me? These people are saying things that, even though they're obviously not in my same situation, but it feels very familiar to me. That idea of being manipulated and being under the thumb of a narcissist and having the whole world be about them and not me at all. That's the first time he relates to that, and he's ever heard anybody express that. And it's starting to make a light bulb go off in his head.
Steph, as usual, I feel like you're doing so much more work than the movie, because like they even say in this movie, like, you gave up your wife and your child, which should be, to me, the moment where you have like that come to Jesus moment of like, wait, to be clear, I don't want to be too hard on this movie, because there are a lot of things that it did that I liked. I thought that, to me, the parts where this movie worked best were where it was light. You guys can disagree with me if you want to, but I thought that where it shined was when it tried to be funny, because a lot of times it was funny. And I thought that little things like Dracula being able to come into his apartment because he had a mat that said, "Come on in," and that was like, "Oh, I've invited you in," is funny. I thought that was cute. Which again, I think would have maybe been better if they had paired just maybe one or two storylines from what was a very crowded plot. Um, to me, it had too many things going. It was just too many plots. I did not truly care that much about Aquafina and her sister and their father, and I felt like I love Ben Schwartz, but even so, like, did I really need him in this movie? I also had a note at the end that said, am I just too old to think that poop jokes are funny? Because when he kicks him in the gut and blood comes out of his mouth and shit comes out of his ass, I was like, am I just too old to think this is like funny anymore?
No, I don't disagree with you. The moments that I liked this movie the most were when it went very odd couple, and I think they should have leaned into that more. Like he's in Renfield's apartment, studio apartment, and Renfield's flipping through the book and trying to find answers, and he's reading answers from the book, and Dracula is responding in the exact way that an abuser narcissist would react, and I think there's moments of that in kind of near the beginning of the movie. Then you get that moment, and I wanted more of that because, again, you're right. If they had just focused on a couple of genres and tones, I think this movie would have been better served.
I thought that it hit a really fun tone most of the time. That was silly and lighthearted. I thought that the moment where the My Chemical Romance song came in was perfect. I laughed pretty hard when the ska song was playing with the drug dealers. I thought that was really funny. In general, I think this movie would have worked better for me if it had just gone 100% comedy.
Yeah.
But when it was comedy, I thought it was really funny and not in like an obvious sort of goofy way, like in a kind of more subtle way than I expected. That was really charming, and I loved it. There were things I genuinely loved. This is a very Kelly thing to focus on, but the practical effects of Dracula, especially after he's kind of been exposed to the sun, I love practical effects, and I thought he looked amazing. I thought that was really fucking fantastic. There was so much I liked about this movie, and I truly don't think I would hold it to the same measure and metric that I did if I didn't think there were so many things that were good about it. I think if it had only had one or two things I thought were good, I'd be like, whatever, it's fine. I liked a lot about this movie, and I just wish it had somehow managed to fulfill the promise of its best parts. Jack?
I want to second what you said there because that's exactly how I felt about this movie. I was frustrated by it because there were so many things to like. And then everything that I liked would kind of get dented and dinged and marred by things that I was like, what? Like, did we really need that? You know, like, because you're right. I mean, the main two leads are fantastic. And what's beautiful about it is they've acted together before, back in The Weatherman, back in like 2005 or something. And so they already have history, you know, on camera. And I think that kind of helped them with their additional chemistry that they brought to these roles together. They played off of each other so well, and I wanted more of that. And you're right, the humor is fan-fucking-tastic. It's sometimes it's over the top and funny, but a lot of times it's kind of a little more subtle. And the whole running ska joke to me was hilarious because fuck ska. And I love that, just that whole running subtext was hilarious. And I wanted more of that. And I wanted more of the odd couple feel of this movie. You're right. The practical effects are fan-fucking-tastic. The action is fan-fucking-tastic. It's just a very strange fit for this movie. There were a lot of things to love. It was very frustrating for the things that I didn't love.
And I guess for me, this is going to make it sound like I am a like I'm a glasses half full kind of person. And I don't think I am. I think I'm very like cynical and jaded as well. But when it comes to movie watching, I'm a very glasses half full person. Maybe not in the everyday life, but definitely in my movie experience. And you guys would say things like, well, I love so much of it that anytime something happened that I didn't love, it disappointed me and it made me wish that it was kind of perfect because the good stuff is so good. I want it all to be great, which is very fair. And I'm not knocking that at all. For me, I'm sort of the opposite. If there's enough good stuff and if the good stuff is really making me happy and making me swoon and like hitting all the right notes, then I will forgive a lot of the bad stuff really easily. And I won't necessarily hold it against a film. I'll be like, you know what? It did enough right. And it brought me enough joy. And I smiled enough during this. Pretty consistently smiled throughout this film and was charmed and felt like really like I'm enjoying seeing these characters on screen. I'm enjoying the interactions. I'm enjoying, a lot of the different elements. Do I think everything works perfectly? Absolutely not. Do I think this is a masterpiece? Hell no. Do I think it's tonally imbalanced? Yep. Like, I think all the criticism is very fair, but for me, it's like I had fucking fun. And so I don't need it to be a perfect film. I don't need it to be a cinematic masterpiece. I say this all the time. I kind of meet films where they are. I think this film is meant to be a super fun, funny, popcorn munching film. I think that's all it's trying to be. It definitely has some it's got some things it's trying to say, but it's also not trying to hit you over the head with it. It's not trying to be super serious. It's not trying to be super heartfelt or meaningful. It's just trying to be like sweet and charming and funny and a good time. And for me, it hit all of those notes. It is a good time meeting this film where it's at. If it wants me to have fun, I had fun.
I think all of that's really, really, really excellent point stuff. My 70-something-year-old mom watched it with me the first time I watched it. And I was talking to her today about her impressions of it. And she told me very nearly, and I quote, I don't really remember that much about it, but I remember thinking it was fun. And I think maybe that's kind of all Renfield wants to be. Just a movie that like you remember thinking, well, in the moment when I was watching it, I had fun. And that's enough. And I don't think I think there's something admirable, honestly, about that goal. Like, you're not going for the Weinstein Oscar bait thing. You're just going for a movie that's fun in the moment, that you enjoy watching while you're watching it. And you don't need to remember it afterwards. You just remember, like, I had a good time watching it.
Fair enough. I feel the same way. Like, I didn't hate it. I actually had a good time watching it. It was not time wasted, but I think you brought a good point up, Kelly, way early in this podcast, where it was like that you'll probably never go back and watch it again. Same. I don't feel that I would never need to watch this again. And not because I hated it, not because I loathed it, but it's just because, okay, I saw it. And there's no reason for me to go back to it. I'm not going to glean anything new from it. In fact, it might be not as fun on a rewatch. So I'm just going to not do that, you know?
It isn't. It's not.
Fair enough.
Spoiler alert.
Okay. Are we ready? Are we ready to do the thing that we need to do?
Let's do it.
I feel like we've already done it as usual, but we'll just summarize and give our final thoughts. So we are at the conclusion. And as we always do at the end of every episode, we take all of these things in context, everything that we've said that we like and we don't like, and we say, hey, at the end of the day, does this qualify as a guilty pleasure? And is it more guilty than pleasure? Is it more pleasure than guilt? Where does it sit in the pantheon of guilty pleasures for us? All right, Jack, you go first because you always make Kelly go first.
I do. That's fair. All right. For me, this was not time wasted. Did I want more from this movie? Yes, I did. But tonal differences notwithstanding, my own expectations notwithstanding, and I definitely can step away from those. That to me, this is the very definition of a guilty pleasure, where yeah, it's got some problems, and yeah, it may play fast and loose with certain things that I would prefer it not play fast and loose with, but I enjoyed it. It was fun. It was funny. It was actually surprisingly very well done. It in all the things that it just did too many things, but all of those things were well done on their own. So yes, absolutely 100% a guilty pleasure. Not unhappy that we watched it. Not unhappy that this was our pick. Will I probably go back and watch it again? No, I don't think I will, but I don't need to because I got everything I needed out of it.
So my assessment of this movie is best encapsulated by what my mom said to me, which was, if you didn't have your history with Dracula, If you hadn't read the book, if you hadn't seen the Francis Ford Coppola, Bela Lugosi, Draculas, what would you think of this movie? And if I didn't have a long, sordid history with Dracula, I think I would have thought this movie was really fun. So my answer to, is it a guilty pleasure, is no, it's not a guilty pleasure, because I don't think there's any reason for anybody to feel guilt about enjoying this movie. I think it's trying a lot of things, and some of them work better than others. But overall, I think it works. I don't know that it's certainly not a classic. It's not something that's gonna like endure through the ages, whatever. But like in the moment, it's really fun. And I don't think there's anything wrong with that, with just being a fun movie for the time you're watching it. And the 93 minutes, because guys, it is 93 goddamn minutes. And if you can't sit still for 93 minutes, well, you got bigger problems than a Dracula movie. And if you can't sit still for the 93 minutes, like turn it off. That's fine. But like in the course of that time, I think it's fun. I think it's cute. Cute was the word I described to watch it the first time I saw it. Which I don't know that that's what they were going for, given how gory it is. But that's what it is. It's kind of just a fun movie that's not necessarily going to stay with you long after you watched it, but you're going to enjoy it while you watched it. So I'm hesitant on the guilty, but I think it is a pleasure.
Yeah, I think that's super fair. And for me, so I have this, like, I had my notes of like, okay, what are the things that I want to say in summary? And I've pretty much covered them all. So I'm just going to say this, like, for me, it's an absolute pleasure. Like, I loved it. And I say that I loved it saying, again, I am not, and I would never be like, oh my God, guys, this is a masterpiece. This is a cinematic treasure. It's, redefining the whole Dracula lore, and it's an essential horror classic. It's none of those things. It's just fucking fun. And I had a great time. I had a smile from ear to ear the entire time, both viewings. The only reason that I would say guilty pleasure, or I would acquiesce to that, is because I think there's enough valid arguments for what doesn't work. I talked about Reddit reviews. I read somebody said, I absolutely fucking loved about 50% of this film. And it's really echoing what we've talked about in this episode, where so much of it works so well. And it is such a goddamn pleasure. And then there's other stuff that really doesn't work, or certainly doesn't work as well as you would like it to work, or potentially just works fine, but detracts for the shit that works a lot better and makes you, you guys, I think, mentioned this, makes you kind of frustrated, because even if you thought that the Aquafina scenes were good, and even if you thought that the crime stuff was good and fine and perfectly serviceable, it's still not as good as the shit that really works. It's still not as fun as the Dracula Renfield interaction. So it makes you sort of like frustrated with this stuff, even if it's totally fine. So I think in that regards, calling it a guilty pleasure or calling it sort of a mixed bag is absolutely fair. We've talked about, you guys know, like I was, and this is full transparency, I was 100% predisposed to love this film. And because of that, and because of Nick Cage being in it, and because of just like how endearing I think these actors are and how good I think they are, I thought it was fast paced. It was never boring for me. I love the fact that it is roughly 90 minutes, which is kind of like a perfect sweet spot. It never overstays its welcome. I think it's clever. I really like the way that the film works as an allegory for toxic relationships. Although even if it doesn't go very deep and it never tries to be super serious about that, I still think that's a really smart, clever, witty approach. And I really appreciated that. And that's it.
Fair enough.
You're here.
But that's our show, folks. If you liked what you heard, please consider liking, following us, rating and reviewing us, and generally just heaping on the love wherever you choose to listen. Until next time, this is the Guilty Pleasures crew signing off and reminding you to give into pleasure wherever you can, and don't you dare feel guilty about it.
Yeah, there's a point in the movie where they tell him he should upgrade his wardrobe, and I was like, no, look at you in your tweed and your vest. Don't change a thing. Don't go into that Cosby sweater. You look top-notch tater tots.
Yeah, when he's all
No,
gaudy
no.
and super pale and like all scraggly haired and really like when he's
I was
supposed to
really
be
into
gross,
it.
I was like, yes, please. So into it.
Very, very into it. Yeah.